That it's definitely my handwriting.
Okay, whatever, I need to go.
That's hilarious.
That's so fun, mid-November, y'all.
Oh my goodness. The same thing at school, at our, so because we get, there were a few different issues we get to choose, like some of them it was, so one was like a wand, that had a hand, one was like that. So that was cute.
How did she? That's why she had me come in. She went for the first time.
We need to get more colorful ones, maybe for next class. Well,
It's a color that's so nice. Oh my gosh.
yeah.
Okay, good afternoon. Big picture. Big picture again. Doesn't quit with the big picture. What's the big picture?
That's the big picture.
Is this the big picture?
I think so.
What's the meaning of this? Okay, what's the big picture here? Analysis of errors. What did we talk about last time? So we started motivating some ideas that we're gonna kind of cover some of the technical details today. What did we cover last time? So I'm gonna just start us off kind of.
We talked about, when to use post hocs and contrast and.
So we started talking about post hocs, contrast, right? In the context of the analysis of variance, right? So the analysis of variance is a huge, huge technique, okay? So, we spend some time on it because if you understand how ANOVA works, you're gonna understand how things like multi-level modeling, hierarchical linear modeling, things like that, how those things work, okay? So, and also if you take my multivariate class, this foundation will really be valuable to you because you'll say, okay, well, we're extending the methods, but it's not all that different, right? The key is to get the foundation. So we've talked about the analysis of variance. We're partitioning variability. Why can we partition variability into between and within? Well, we can do that because it can be shown mathematically that the sums of squares for total can be partitioned into between and within, right? So between and within. And then we talked about degrees of freedom, and then you divide the sums of squares by degrees of freedom to get what? What do you get? Look like this, and they're like that. What do you get? They go, what are they? Sorry, I forgot I'm on camera, I better behave. Okay, so like this, like this. What are they? Sums of squares divided by degrees of freedom. Is this here? What is it? There's something in the salad, I mean, I tell you. Well, what is this? Is this? What's this? That's a square, and a square.
Angry?
Angry square?
Mean square.
Is this what I've taught you? A mean square, right. I mean, angry was close. I'll give you the point for it. Yeah. It's a mean square. What's a mean square? Right, what's a mean square? What is it? Right, what's a mean square? I mean, did we learn a mean square before? Before doing ANOVA, did we learn a mean square? Yeah, which one? Which mean square did we learn? Because we did, right? That's what happens in stats is you learn new terminology, then you go, wait a minute, we actually did that 2 years ago. We actually learned that. We just couldn't call it that because if I had called that thing by mean square, you'd have been, why are you calling it that, right? So, but we did. When we did what, the variance? How is the variance a mean square? So what does it mean? Yeah, mean square? We took the sum of square deviations divided by
Degrees of freedom.
degrees of freedom, right? And oftentimes what we divided by was n, or what was it?
Standard deviation.
Yeah, oh, careful, don't get crazy on me. What is it? Divided by just a little bit. Okay, we divided by sums of squares deviation divided by.
Standard deviation?
It's not the standard error, it's not the standard deviation. To get the variance, sums of square deviations divided by n or n minus one, right? That n minus one in the denominator, we lost one what? Degree of freedom. We lost a degree of freedom. So really what we were computing was a mean square. We were computing a mean square even when we computed the variance. So when we're talking about this ANOVA idea, and if we go back to our ANOVA table, wherever it is, see if I can put it down there, I forget, right there. These mean squares, I mean, we get the feeling for what these things actually are. These are variances, right? The mean squares are variances, but it's not the same variance as we computed when we just did the overall variance. These are variances that reflect different quantities, right? They reflect different things in our data. This variance reflects between variation, and this variance reflects the within variation, right? But you see the analogy. We've got sums of squares divided by degrees of freedom. That's the same thing we did when we computed the variance. We took a sums of squares deviations divided by degrees of freedom. Yes, the degrees of freedom were different. There was n minus one, now they're j minus one for between and n minus j, but the concept is the same. So the analysis of variance, we get those two sources of variance. We got the between, we got the within, right over here. So you cross the river of degrees of freedom, get to the mean squares, and then we're all set. Then what's the inferential goal here? What's the goal? You want to do a comparison of variances? And what question are we asking? We're saying, hey, how big is this variance compared to this variance? How big is this variance compared to this variance, right? And then we say, well, under the null hypothesis, the null hypothesis is about what? Population means, right? So under the null hypothesis, what would we expect that comparison to be equal to about? Equal to about, yeah, exactly. So this variance compared to this variance, that should give us approximately 1. For theoretical reasons, it actually doesn't equal exactly 1, but that is far, far removed from what we need to be concerned about. I'm going, you know, that should be about 1. So this thing here, this F ratio, is a comparison of variances. This variance relative to this variance. Under the null, we expect it to be about 1. So what are we looking for? Well, let's say you get the F of 3, right? You get the F of 3, let's say. What do you ask that F?
What are the odds?
Yeah, how probable are you, right? How probable is getting an F of, say, 3? Right? Well, again, how do we determine the probability? There's only one way of determining the probability here. We have to do what? We have to take that F and we have to compare it to something. What are you going to compare it to? F distribution. What's the F distribution? What is it more generally? Most general principle? F distribution is the what of the F statistic? Sampling distribution, right? Sampling distribution. So you're comparing your statistic to the sampling distribution. You're comparing your statistic to the sampling distribution. So if I gave you a really, really weird statistic, or you come across a weird statistic someday, and then you say, well, geez, what's the probability of getting a statistic like this? You need to compare that statistic to the sampling distribution of that statistic, or there could be a related distribution, because there's a lot of conversions that can take place too. So you may evaluate some weird statistic relative to a sampling distribution and say, why are we comparing that to a chi-square distribution? Well, because it's related to F and there's a whole bunch of relations in there. But the key is you're relating the statistic to a sampling distribution. You place that statistic in the sampling distribution, right? Which sampling distribution? it's an F distribution, in this case, it's an F distribution, but how many F distributions are there? How many F sampling distributions are there? Yeah, theoretically, there's an infinite number. There's an infinite number. So when you look what the computer's doing, right, what the computer's doing is saying, let's evaluate the probability of that F on j minus 1 and n minus j degrees of freedom. On j minus 1 and n minus j degrees of freedom, that specifies the distribution of F under the null hypothesis, right? Under the null hypothesis. So you're comparing it to the distribution of j minus 1 and n minus j. You place your F statistic, this is what the computer's doing, is placing it in that distribution, and from there, it's determining what's the probability of getting a statistic like that, right? So you see what this idea is. This here is saying what's the probability of an F like that under the null hypothesis. That's equivalent to saying what's the probability of an F statistic like that, assuming the F was born or arose from an F distribution on j minus 1 and n minus j degrees of freedom. Does that make sense? See, whichever way you say it is fine as long as you understand what's going on, right? It's kind of like the coin. It's kind of like saying, what's the probability of 2 heads out of 5 flips? Well, assuming it came from this null distribution, here's the probability. So we have to make the assumption of where it came from, and that's what is happening in ANOVA. So your F comes out to be 3, and then say you determine that it's what? Less than 5%, right? What does the P is less than 0.05 mean? It means, you know, F's like that happen actually relatively rarely under the null hypothesis. They actually don't happen very much. So if that P value gets to be pretty low, then what do? You reject the null, right? You reject the null, and the rejection of the null here says what? It says, you know what? It looks like somewhere in those means is a difference, right? Somewhere in those means is a difference, but the rejection of the overall F is not going to tell you where those differences are. It's not going to tell you where, right? So, you know, if you have, say, like 10 means, well, mean 1 different from mean 2, that's a big difference. That's enough to maybe reject the null, because that's going to be reflected in your SS between. Even if 3 equals 4 equals 5, maybe that's those first 2 means are really different from another, and that's enough to push that null hypothesis aside. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So that doesn't say, I've got 2 questions, but that example there, that doesn't say where, it doesn't necessarily say where you're seeing the difference.
Correct.
It just says that there is a difference.
That's right. That's right. It's saying, you know what, it looks like inferentially there's a difference between means, but we don't know where it is, right? Because you have the multiple means. I mean, did we have that problem in the t-test? No. Why didn't we? There's only one way, right? So we don't do a t-test and go, geez, I'm stumped. Where does the difference happen? Well, there's only 2 means, so it's got to be between those 2 means. But for the ANOVA, we call it sometimes an omnibus test, an overall test. It's telling you, you know what, you may want to look into this because it looks like somewhere between those means, there's a difference. Somewhere between those means, there's a difference, okay? So after that, you say, you know what, I've rejected my null hypothesis. Now comes the next phase. Well, what's the next phase that we talked about last time? What's the next phase? Okay, start off with the idea of the contrasts, right? What's those, we talked about effect size, all that stuff. What's the contrast idea? That's that big thing we started talking about last time, right? Contrast. Remember I had up on the board, it's like this thing about, are you looking at the data, are you not looking at the data? Right? Who's confused by that? What does it matter whether you look at the data? I mean, that sounds silly. Right? What's that big picture there? Someone want to summarize it? What's that big picture of the contrast versus post hoc idea? Start off with the contrast.
The contrast is when you don't see the data ahead of time and you can make a prediction on the means based on your prior knowledge or experience.
Okay, excellent. So the contrast is when you haven't looked at the data beforehand. You haven't looked at it. Okay. Now, does it matter when you collect it? Not really. I could look at data 3,000 years ago and have a good theoretical prediction of what it should look like. That data's been sitting there for 3,000 years. Okay, so So it's not, that would be a bad argument if we said, well, data's getting pretty old. You better do a post hoc. No. It's not the age of the data, it's whether you've looked at it. Now, what does it really matter whether you look at it, right? What does it really matter whether you look at it? Well, put up on the board, say 3 or 4 means, it's an entirely different situation. If I compare, those, say the 4 means, so mean 1, mean 2, mean 3, and mean 4, it's an entirely different situation. If before I look at the means, I predict an inequality here, then I obtain the data, and then I see if this comparison actually held, if there actually is a difference. That's an entirely different situation than if what? Than if I actually get the data, look at the means, and then make this comparison. Does that make sense? Does that kind of hit home here? Because that's really important, because, well, I mean, what's the deal, right? Some of this stuff you can kind of just reason through it and kind of almost put it in different languages. Like, if you observe the means, right? If this mean is, say, 50, and this is 100, and this is 49, and this is 48, and you have to do a comparison, which comparison are you gonna make? You're gonna do this one. You go, hey, well, oh, actually, no, you're not, right? You're gonna do 48, so let's change that. Let's go 48, 49, and 50. You're gonna go 48 versus 100 because that's the biggest separation you have. That would be the comparison you probably choose to do if your objective is to reject the null hypothesis, because you say, I have a good idea where the mean difference is. Well, of course you do. The means are right here, right? So what does the post hoc come in and say? Yeah, quick question.
Is it just essentially trying to attempt to rectify like the subconscious human, like, just had it, like, it's your subconscious, like, determination of patterns, I guess, I'm not really sure.
It's the Freudian id.
Yeah.
Right? It's the Freudian id. Okay, yeah. So what it is this is what it is. If you look at 48 versus 100, okay, think of it, right? If 48 versus 100, and someone says, which comparison do you want to make out of these? You have to get to make one. And if you say, I'm gonna compare 48 to 100, and you try telling somebody that's the only comparison I just made when I looked at the data, right? That's the only comparison I made. I want to compare 48 to 100. How many comparisons did you make? Well, nobody knows. Nobody knows how many comparisons you made. But the problem is what does the post hoc test say? The post hoc test is not an easy customer, right? What does the post hoc test say? It says, it's like they're cynical. What does the post hoc test say? You know what? No way, no way. I don't trust you, is what you were talking about. I don't trust you that you just said 48 versus 100 is the only comparison you actually made. I don't think you did that. I don't think you did that. Now, if this was the case, I'm more tempted to believe you because you hadn't looked at the data yet. So when you said, I want to make this comparison, I had no reason to doubt you. I had no reason to doubt that you actually were making this comparison because these means aren't even known yet. These are just position holders. So when you look at this data, I mean, not even data, it's just means. If you say, I want to make this comparison, I'm not going to punish you for making this comparison because you didn't make it, right? You didn't make it. So what's the only way that this can arise, right? What's the only way that this contrast can actually arise, really? If it's not looking at the data, then where's it coming from? Right? Yeah, it's got to come from previous experience or theoretical prediction or kind of, informed knowledge of, I think the example we use that it's going to snow in Cut Bank, it's not going to snow in Missoula. Wow, and then the data coming, my goodness, you're right. You're right. Wow, there's going to be a lot of difference between Cut Bank snow versus Missoula snow. That's impressive. Wow, these people really know what they're doing. That's entirely different than if you observe the snowfall and then you say, Cut Bank got more snow than Missoula. What is that really? That's just a description of what you're seeing, right? It's a description of what you're seeing. So in here, does that make sense? In here is a big thing. It's not a small thing. It's what all scientific investigation and credibility is about. It's contained in this idea. Because the very idea of being able to make predictions is what science is about. So if you can make a prediction based on your knowledge and your study, wow, you're pretty good. You're pretty good, right? Maybe you actually know what you're doing if you can actually predict the behavior. So to use the Skinnerian example, you know, the Skinner doesn't observe the Skinner box and just observe the behavior. Well, they do it for a little while to get some baseline, go, you know what? You put the pellet, the pigeon walks over and eats it, right? Interesting. Let's observe this for a while. Okay, got it. Got the principle. Operant conditioning. Let's try it on a new pigeon. Let's try it on a new pigeon, and if our theoretical prediction is correct, this should happen. Okay, run it. Look at that. It worked. We were absolutely right that this happened. What Skinner did there is he made the prediction based on prior experience, based on knowledge, based on a theoretical principle, based on our calculations that the asteroid will hit the Earth in 2040, based on our prediction. Entirely different than going, the asteroid hit yesterday. Okay. Or based on when the California earthquake will happen, based on California earthquake happened yesterday. So this here, when you do this, and you decide to do a contrast here, the key issue is what's your type 1 error rate? Because we know with every comparison, right, with every rejection of the null hypothesis, we have a risk of what? We have a risk of making a type 1 error. We have a risk of making a type 1 error. What does that mean on an intuitive level? Well, it means that when you reject HO, does that mean HO is false? No, it just means you're rejecting it, right? It just means you're rejecting it. So you reject it, you don't know if it's false or not, you have a risk of a type 1 error. So if I make this comparison, I say I'm going to compare 3 to 4, I have a risk of a type 1 error rate. Maybe I said that 0.05. That's my type 1 error rate. Even though I have a lot of means here, I'm only making this comparison. So that's fine for contrast, and it's fine if you have theoretical prediction and people will buy it, that what your theoretical prediction is. But what happens is after you look at the means, when the data come in, whether it's historical data, whether it's new data, when this comes in, nobody believes you anymore. Even if you had this in mind, no one's going to believe you after you've looked at the means and enter the post hoc. And what does the post hoc say? Let's put it in English. What the post hoc is saying. And just put it kind of like saying, well, the post hoc comes in and says, you know what? You're making more than, I don't know how many comparisons you're making, but I'm sure you're making more than the comparisons you made. So, you know, when you start making pairwise comparisons, you have a type 1 error rate associated with each comparison, and those add up. Now, we like to keep our type 1 error rate at a nominal level, like 0.05. Why? Always remember the big picture, right? Why do you want to keep your type 1 error rate at, say, 0.05? Maybe you want to keep it lower depending on the situation. Why are we so concerned with not letting this inflate? You know, what is it about that type 1 error rate? You know, we say, well, keep it at about 0.05 or even less. What's wrong with the type 1 error rate of 0.25?
Can't make any conclusions.
Well, you can draw conclusions, right? You can draw conclusions with a type 1 error rate of 0.25, but if that type 1 error rate starts getting higher and higher, that increases the chance of what? That the conclusions you're making actually isn't really true, right? So, you know, think about it practically. If I take the research report and I go, look, they found a cure for the disease. And I look at the methodology and I go, there's a sale at JCPenney's. No, sorry, that's an airplane joke if you've watched Airplane before. Okay, so you look at that and you go, oh, the type 1 error rate is 0.50? Oh, why does, as a scientist, why am I kind of, cure, methodology, type 1 error rate of 0.50. What does that mean to me as a scientist?
There's a 50% chance
Yeah, in other words, you know, well, they said they found something, but actually there's kind of like a 50% chance it's just due to chance. That there's really nothing there, could just be a false rejection of the null. So as the type 1 error rate starts to increase over comparisons, boy, I mean, the kind of like the confidence in the science starts to wane a little bit. That's why we're so strict with trying to keep it at a nominal level. So what does the post hoc do? The post hoc test comes in and says, you know what? I have a way that you can keep your type 1 error rate at a pretty low level, let's say at a nominal level, like 0.05, even though you looked at the means, right? Even though you looked at the means. So what it's gonna have, what's it gonna do? It's gonna put some adjustment on the type 1 error rate per comparison, right? Per comparison. So that over all the comparisons, your type 1 error rate's pretty low, pretty low. So we talked about the Bonferroni technique, which divides the overall error rate by the number of comparisons. But we said there's also a problem with that, right? What's the problem with that? Well, the problem with the Bonferroni is that if you have a lot of comparisons to make, right? If you have a lot of comparisons to make, what happens? What do you lose?
Power.
You lose power, right? Why? How does that work that you lose power? Well, you know, if you split up that overall alpha by the number of comparisons, I mean, next thing you know, you're trying to test each comparison at 0.00001. My goodness, you're never gonna reject it. So you see that other balance, right? Like, we don't want it to be too strict because maybe the disease is hurting people. We wanna get something out there, so it's a balancing of risks, right? We do the balancing of risks on the highway every day. Should I pass? Should I not? Well, it all depends, right? If you play it too conservative, then you never pass and you follow the log truck forever, going 40 miles per hour. But, you know, so you take a bit of a risk. How much risk do you take? So there's always a risk in those things, and there's a risk in science that way. So we want to do a post hoc, we want to control the type 1 error rate. Now there's a number of post hoc tests available. Let's look at this one, which is the Newman-Coyle's test. It's actually not that common of a test that's used anymore. I mean, it's still relatively popular, but the insight into how post hocs generally work is very powerful by looking at this test. So let's look at this ANOVA example. And then you see other tests, they have slightly different methodologies, but the principles are very much the same. So here we have achievement scores by teacher. So I have teacher 1, 2, 3, 4. So these are average achievement scores, right? So there's the teacher 1, 71, 72, 80, 92.67. Okay. So let's think about what we have in the actual table are mean differences. So the mean difference between teacher 1 and teacher 1 is 0. The mean difference teacher 2 and teacher 1 is 1.5. 80 versus 71 is 9, etc., etc. So if we were to invent a post hoc test, so Newman-Coyle's comes around, and they look at this and they say, I see you've got all your means, right? I see you've got all your means laid out in the table. How would a post hoc, if you get the principle here, the details are easy. How would a post hoc like this maybe function to try to get a handle on the overall type 1 error rate? If we come up with an idea, just say, how could it even approximate this idea, this idea of controlling the type 1 error rate? Well, let me give you an example. If I take, let's say, teacher 1, if I do this comparison, teacher 1 versus teacher 4. So we notice that the means are ranked in order. 71, 72, 80, 92, from smallest to largest. So if I told Newman-Coyle's, if I said, okay, what I really want to do is compare teacher 1 to teacher 4 in terms of a pairwise mean difference. Newman-Coyle says this. Newman-Coyle says, oh, I see. You're comparing the smallest mean to the largest mean, right? Why are you doing that? Okay, so I'll be Newman-Coyle's. Why are you doing that? You guys answer. Why are you doing it? Why are you comparing why would you want to compare 71 to 92.6? Why are you interested in that comparison?
To get the greatest difference.
Yeah, the greatest difference, right? Again, at that point, maybe you did have theoretical prediction, but you kind of threw that out after you looked at the data. So this no longer applies. So the likely reason why you may be interested in that comparison is because, you know, that's got the furthest separation in means. It's got the furthest separation in means. So what does Newman-Coyle say? Newman-Coyle says this, says, yeah, I kind of figured, right? I kind of figured that's what you would do. Takes a lot more courage to do what?
To compare similar means?
Yeah, to compare similar means, right? Like, can we give an example? Like compare teacher 1 to teacher 2. So if you told Newman-Coyle, said, you know what, I actually want to compare teacher 1 to teacher 2, what's Newman-Coyle's gonna do? What's their attitude? Gonna say, you know what?
Go ahead.
Courageous. Well, yeah, go ahead, but I'm gonna cut you a break. I'm gonna cut you a break. Why? Because that's a harder comparison to pass than the 1 versus 4, right? So the 1 versus 4, Newman-Coyle's is gonna say, you know what, if you're gonna make those comparisons, I know what you're up to, you're trying to get the biggest mean difference, you're gonna have to pass what? A tougher test. Right? You're gonna have to pass a tougher test than if you're comparing, say, 3 to 4, 2 to 3, and things like that. Does that make sense? The tougher test happens with the means that are furthest apart because we would kind of expect that to happen. Whereas the lighter test happens for means that are more similar. Okay. So we say that contained in each of the cells are pairwise mean differences. We've talked about that. We've got the largest pairwise difference. And then we have layer 1 represents a mean difference of 2 steps. So we look at layer 1, well, the 2 steps, the k equals 2 is teacher 4 to 3. That's considered a 2-step difference. That's considered a 2-step difference. 3, 4, okay? Well, if you look at what else has a 2-step difference, well, you have teacher 2 to teacher 3. Teacher 3, teacher 2 is also a 2-step difference. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna evaluate this mean difference by a certain critical value, and then we're gonna move up the diagonal and evaluate this mean difference by a certain critical value, and then move up the diagonal and evaluate this by a certain critical value, because all of these means are what? All of these comparisons along this diagonal are 2 steps apart. They're 2 steps apart. So we're gonna evaluate all the 2 steps apart differences by the same critical value. Now if we look at the next one, layer 2, which is equal to k equals 3, k equals 3 steps apart, what do we have? Teacher 3 versus 2, 2, 3, 4, 3 steps apart. Well, this difference is gonna be evaluated by its own critical value, and then this one, move up the diagonal. This one here, because that's 3 versus 1, so there's another 3 steps. That should have what kind of critical value? It had a tougher critical value to pass than the 2-step, right? What's the toughest test? Well, the toughest test makes sense. Should be this one, right? There's no other diagonal count, it's just this one. So 21.67, it's called layer 3, and it's k equals 4. What are the 4 steps? Teacher 1, 2, 3, 4. What's the toughest test in this in terms of the critical value? Not surprisingly, it's teacher 1 to teacher 4. Teacher 1 to teacher 4 is the toughest test. What do we mean by toughest test again? What do we mean? It's gonna have the toughest critical value. It's gonna have the toughest critical value. You remember when we adjusted degrees of freedom, right? We adjusted degrees of freedom in the comparison of variances. It's all about how tough the test is. So the easiest test should be for the most courage, whereas the toughest critical value should be where the teacher 1 versus teacher 4. Okay. So the rest is all in the math is just figuring out what those critical values are for the different tests. So if we look here, we've got layer k equals 1, and we're going to compute what's called the software is going to do this. It's going to compute a Q value. Okay, a Q value, and this is for alpha, number of steps, and degrees of freedom from the ANOVA. Q times MS error. MS error is coming from your ANOVA divided by the N per group, and that's gonna be your layer K minus 1. So if we look at the example here, I think we have an example. Demonstrate the computation of the critical value for layer 1. We had said there's layer 1 up there. Well, there it is. We're gonna compute that. It's equal to 5.23. So this is our critical value, right? This is the critical value for Q for the above is 2.950. Now, where is this critical value for Q coming from? That's coming from the old dusty stats book with the tables at the back. We don't have to worry about it. And the software is just, it knows Q. It knows Q really well, and it's just giving us that critical value for Q. Other than that, you don't have to worry about Q. You don't have to, Q doesn't have any mystical meaning to it. It's just a statistic that's needed in computing this Newman coils. So it's gonna go in there when we look at it in software, it's computing a Q. The value of the layer is equal to 5.23. So we say if our obtained pairwise difference meets or exceeds a value of 5.23, we may deem it statistically significant at the 0.05 level, right? That's all it is. So say, there's your layer, there's the mean difference that you need to pass for you to reject that null hypothesis. We see that 12.67 does exceed 5.23, so we can say that teacher 4 to 3, there's a statistically significant difference, right? In other words, the probability of that mean difference is actually pretty low under the null hypothesis. So that's how that test works, and it's going to compute different Q, different layered values, mean difference criteria for values along each of those diagonals. Yes?
Is there a specific name for this Q? Is it called like a Q statistic, like it is a T or a Z or?
Yeah, well, it's just called a Q, and it has its own sampling distribution. It's used in other places as well, but for our purposes, we just needed to get into the test, right? There's some statistics out there that they don't have it doesn't have like the meaning of like a T or a Z as we typically use it. There's a lot of theoretical statistics that are just needed to make the theory kind of glue together, and Q is one of those. And you'll never see Q again. I mean, this is it. Enjoy it now, because you'll never see Q. Theoretically, if you go into more theoretical stats, you may say, well, the Q distribution is this and therefore this, but otherwise you're not gonna see it. So, it's a layered test, and we see how it functions. The Newman coils test. Now, the Newman coils test attempts to get a handle on the type 1 error rate. When folks do simulation research on these tests, and there's people who do that, they spend their careers analyzing post hoc tests, and they say, geez, what's the true type 1 error rate of the Newman coils? And then they run simulation data, which has its weaknesses because simulation data is not analytical. It's based on getting like random numbers from computers and things. But when they do simulation tests, they find that, the Newman coils, that doesn't always keep it at a good level, kind of can fluctuate a little bit and things like that. So there's a little bit of uncertainty over what that Newman coils will actually accomplish. And for some reasons like that, it's sometimes, not considered to be maybe the best test out there. But you see how it works, and that's meaningful. Enter the Tukey test. Now, what does the Tukey test say? Well, the Tukey test, HSD, stands for honestly significant difference. Okay, so honestly significant difference. I mean, Tukey was a person, and Tukey said, you know what? Let's get a little bit of a harder test. Let's get a little bit of a harder test. So what does Tukey do? Well, Tukey takes the results of the Newman coils and does this. Make it harder. Make it harder. You know what? Instead of this layered approach, Tukey says, you know what? This is too easy. This is too soft of a test. Test everything against this one. Test everything against 4 versus 1. So whatever critical value you're getting here, test all the differences against that. Right? And you see, my goodness, boy, that's tough. That's tough, right? Because Tukey is not even affording you that layered approach. It's just saying take the hardest difference and test everything against it. Now, why would Tukey do that? Now, why would Tukey do that? mean, what's the logic of it, right? So again, I'm looking at the scientific result and I go, oh, they found a cure. Let me see what kind of test they did. And I look there and go, oh, they found that they did a Tukey.
The increased power.
Yeah, let's see, wait a minute, is it increased power? Do I look at that and I go, do I feel better when I see a Tukey, they passed the Tukey test? Do I say, oh, they passed the Tukey test? Is that a better thing for me as a consumer than if I look and I go, oh, they passed the Newman coils? Which one's better? Tukey, why? Yeah. Is it more conservative, liberal? Yeah, more conservative, right? Honestly significant, right? It's honestly significant, like lick it, stick it, stamp it, honestly significant. Tukey's trying to say, you know what? If you can find a difference with the Tukey, yeah, you're actually a little bit more certain that there is actually a difference, okay? For that reason, many people like the Tukey. It's a well-known test. It has a fair bit of scientific credibility. So if we look at these differences here between the means, so we got teach means, 2 versus 1, 3 versus 1, 4 versus 1, etc. So here's all the differences. Well, it gives us our p-values. Okay. Is there a difference between 2 versus 1? Well, not according to the adjusted p-value. Right? So you see why p-values would be adjusted here without going into all the details of Tukey. You see where the adjustment's coming from, right? You see, well, oh, I see why the p-value is adjusted, because it's making it a little bit harder. It's making it harder. You have 3 versus 1. Well, that one we easily rejected. That one's coming close, right? 3 versus 2. Right. Let's just look at that 3 versus 2. Right? That 3 versus 2 is what? 0.03. What would be our conclusion there? 3 versus 2, mean 3 versus 2. It's 0.03. You're rejecting? Sure, if you're using 0.05, right? If you're using 0.01, you're not. What if that p-value ended up being 0.051? P, for that comparison, 0.051. What would be our conclusion?
Cry.
You do what?
Cry.
Would you really?
No.
Is it that bad? That's just because it's the end of semester placement. That's what it is. Because, I mean, well, who would cry over that? Would say, 0.051, oh, darn it, missed it. Did you say that? Okay, who would, let's take a survey. Let's make it empirical. Who would say, maybe not cry, but you say, bummer, I was really hoping I'd see a difference there. Darn, couldn't make it. Guess there's no difference in 3 and 2. Or I guess we can't conclude there's a difference, right, between 3 and 2 because, P is 0.051. Who would say that? Who would say something different? Who wouldn't say anything at all? Who would say something different from that? Why would you say something different? I mean, what's the counter to that? So there's our default, say, I didn't make it, oh well, heck with that data, go with something else. What would you say?
It could be that because of the adjusted p-value, you lost power and therefore you have 0.051. but
Okay,
you
so,
have
right, so
the
what we're saying here is, well, because of the adjusted p-value, you may be losing a little bit of power, but that's exactly what we wanted the test to do, right? We want to be careful, we don't blame to say, well, we've lost some power, but it's actually doing what it's supposed to. If that's, like, imagine not even a post hoc, imagine it's the contrast. Imagine it's the contrast, even no adjustment, and you got this. You did one comparison, and you got this. So what do you do when you report this to who you're working for, or the journal? You say, well, maybe t-test. T-test comes up to 0.051. How are you reporting that? Well, if we take it formally, what would you do? If you set your alpha at 0.05, would you reject? No. Now let's take it outside of the formal statistics book and treat it as a scientist, because you're using the statistics as a scientist. What does this mean to you? What does the 0.051 mean to you? Does this mean something very much different than 0.041 0.49? No. Who says this is drastically different? It's like, wow, left and right. No, not at all. These two things are essentially the same. Okay, they're essentially the same thing. So, does everyone appreciate why? I mean, well, where is that in the sampling distribution? We're talking about like minuscule differences here. This is basically the same scientific result. The fact that one is a little bit over 0.05 and one is a little bit less, I'm like, my goodness, we're splitting hairs. Okay. So scientifically, this means what to you? This means, hey, might be something going on. Let's look at the effect size. Let's look into it a little bit further. Never ever take this to mean no and this to mean yes. Okay. If you don't understand how the significance test works, and all of us in here are understanding and saying, no, we're actually appreciating what the significance test really is, then you'll see that they're basically almost the same. Numerically slightly different, but not enough for you to kind of say, well, there's no scientific effect in one case versus the other. So when we look at this, where that came from is, 0.03, yeah, it's a rare result. It's less than 0.05. Looks like there's a difference there. Okay. That was one of the big misunderstandings, by the way, in the history of using significance tests, is even journal editors, right, who are supposed to know better because they're supposed to have reviewers who can spot these things. I mean, historically, some papers say, no, we can't accept it, you didn't achieve statistical significance because of things like this, which is ridiculous. That's very, very close. And given what we know about things like sample size and stuff like that, we know how that works. So, if it's 0.070, well, maybe it's getting a little bit high. 0.10, 0.15, but not for that small difference. So we look at our Tukey results, and we say, well, there's differences everywhere except for 2 versus 1. That one has a pretty high p-value, but the rest looks like we have some pretty good certainty that there's some differences happening pairwise. So here's the question, right? If I take this and I say, instead of the Tukey, I'm going to apply an even harder test. Well, what would you expect to happen to those p-values? What would happen if I used a harder test, meaning I'm going to make it even more conservative? I want to make really sure that if I conclude there's a difference, there's actually a difference. What happens to those p-values? Yeah, do they go up or down? So harder test, right? Tukey we said is harder than Newman coils. And then you get another test, the hardliner is coming up, it's called Scheffé. And Scheffé comes in and says, boy, Tukey's pretty tough, but I'm even tougher. What happens to these p-values? Go up? Go down? If they went down, that would mean what? More, yeah, a bit of a softer test. A bit of an easier test. Gives you more, easier test gives you more power, right? Because then you're rejecting more null hypotheses. Easier to reject, yep, got it. Okay, if it's the other way, tougher test, you say, my goodness, this is great. Let's go to the extreme, get a really, really tough test. You get a really tough test, well, wait a minute. You never leave the lab and publish anything because you can't reject anything. Do we have a cure for the superbug that's starting to sweep the world? No, because we're using it too tough of a test. So then the National Health Association could ease up a little bit. Well, we might do so with a bit of risk error. If it's okay, we have people who die. Get something out there. We got to see if something works. Right? You think of the experimental treatments. What was signed into law, the right to try idea. That somebody's terminally ill, and there's a treatment out there that we're not quite sure if it works or not. Maybe it works on rats a little bit. We're uncertain that they even get the chance to try it out. Anything works, right? Anything to try. Well, the same kind of idea here is just because we can't get a low alpha level, put something out there and let's see if it works. So if we introduce a harder test, we would expect those p-values to bump up. Those p-values are going to bump up because all of a sudden, 0.03, well, maybe that bumps up to 0.06, 0.07, because it's a harder test.
I was gonna say, like in the case of like NIH, why why would you choose such an incredibly tough test if your goal was to really to?
That's a good question, right? The question is why, why would you choose such a really hard test? Why, if you wanna get something out there for the superbug, why choose too hard of a test?
Gives you more confidence.
Well, it gives you more confidence. Here's the thing, what's the logic behind those hard tests? Okay? Why is it when I looked at the report, I was a little bit happier to see the Tukey than the Newman coils? Because we wanna know that if this scientific result is making it out there, we want it to actually represent something real. We don't want it to say, well, we found something, but who the heck knows, because our type 1 error rate is like inflated, so this could just be due to a fluke. The conservatism operates, it has a purpose, that we don't want to fill the journals with a bunch of what? Crap, right? I was going to say type 1 error, but that's the same thing, right? You don't want to fill, I think I used it before too, right? You don't want to fill it with a bunch of type 1 errors, because otherwise you got the whole journal that goes, this is, wow, a lot of chance this happened. This doesn't really work. The type 1 error rate is 0.4, 0.5, 0.6. At the same time, if you reduce the type 1 error rate too small, and you're too tough, you're too conservative, then what does the journal look like? Nothing's published. We'll let you know we're still trying to pass the test. We're still trying to pass the test, 99 rats out of 100 survived. Let's publish the darn thing. Now we gotta wait until it's 100. Too tough.
So that balance between power and type 1 error is that ultimately?
That's basically what we're looking at for the post hoc. Yeah, basically the sensitivity of the test to actually detect something that's there versus making a whole bunch of type 1 errors.
So are there ways?
Yeah.
You can just get, I feel like you can get drowned by tests on tests, right?
Oh, you can.
You can test to see if you can use this test to make this.
Yep.
So can you test how tough a test should be for your ANOVA?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So right. Welcome to the world of statistics, right? So the issue is this, saying, how many post hoc tests are out there? There's probably, let's see, at least probably about 100, maybe even more. And people are like spending their careers, maybe not so much anymore, they're doing other things, but still, like there's like, let's develop a new post hoc test, maybe there's not 100, maybe less than that, maybe there's only 30, 40, something like that. But a whole bunch of different post hoc tests, so then the next question becomes, as a researcher, right, you look at all the, you say, oh my goodness, so how am I supposed to justify what post hoc to test, what post hoc test to use for my data? So then you go to, who are you gonna go to? Go to somebody else, say, I understand post hoc test, now tell me which one to use. But how are you gonna decide which one to use? Well, there's no test for that, right? There's no test to tell you which test to use. There's nothing like that. You have to be the consumer of the test and understand how the tests differ to be able to make just a decision, understanding what it's protecting against, understanding how severe of a test it is, how basically liberal versus conservative. So here's we're entering the world of, and it gets worse, right? Because you wait till the spring, you're going, oh my goodness, right? We're entering the world of this. We're entering the world of this. The world is this. Is there a difference between means? You look, you go, depends on what I'm looking with my lenses, okay? Why? Because these are not population parameters. You're just looking at sample mean difference. So the way, not to get too mystical, but the way you look at things will influence the conclusions you draw. And in statistics, why we say, my goodness, statistics is so slippery, it's because there's a whole bunch of different ways of looking at it, different microscopes to look at it, and will influence what you see, okay? Will influence what you see. You can draw the comparison between diagnostic tests. It's the same, it's really the same idea, right? Diagnostic tests, if you take, they develop different tests for diseases and things like that. So if you go into the doctor, you say, I think something might be up. And I remember I lost a friend, an acquaintance to colon cancer like years ago. And he was like 28 years old and he had colon cancer and he died. So being a little bit of the hypochondriac I am, I went to the doctor. I said, okay, so what's going on here, right? Maybe I should get a test, because I was about the same age and things like that. So what the doctor actually told me, I was younger at the time, and he says, we can give you a test, but it's probably not gonna reveal whether you even have it or not, right? Whether you even have colon cancer. In other words, for your age group, that sensitivity in detecting colon cancer is just not very good. So in other words, we could do it, but if it reports colon cancer, it's probably gonna be an error, and we're not quite even sure, whether that would actually indicate you have it. In other words, for your age and your risk factors, it's probably not that good of a test. Now, coming back to see us when you're 50 and 60, and then the test improves, okay? So the diagnostic test that you get does not mean you actually have the disease. There was a case it was in Germany with HIV testing, where the proper way to interpret an HIV test isn't just based on the actual result of the test. So if I get a result back for the test, if I'm a doctor and I test you, take the blood, look at it, and the test says HIV positive, that doesn't mean deterministically that you have HIV. That's just the sign. So what should I do as a good statistical person, as a doctor knowledgeable of statistics? The test comes back positive. What should I do after that? I could test you again, right? But if I just have the one test, what should I do? You're in front of me. I go, what should I ask you? Well, I can ask you if you have symptoms and say no, but we know that doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? So I look at it and go, well, you tested positive. So then you say, does that mean I have HIV? What's my response? Okay, not necessarily, and then you say, that's very nice, right? That's very nice, you've covered your butt, very good. Now, what's the next question? What should I ask you as the doctor?
Have you had sex with somebody who's HIV positive?
Exactly, right? What's your risk factors? Do you come from, have you been engaged in risky behavior? Now, it may seem very, very weird that you may say, what the heck does that have to do with it? Do I have it or do I not? Well, we don't know, because this is just a sign, and your probability of being having HIV will increase if you're sharing needles every day than if you're not. And if you say, you know what, no, I don't engage in risky behavior, no needles, nothing like that, all of a sudden the probability of HIV goes down. And that's a really, really amazing thing, because you figure, my goodness, it should just matter on the test. But the tests are usually not that good. They come with error rates. These come with error rates too. So what happens is, if you say, well, I share needles, risky behavior, your probability of HIV goes up. So and that's called Bayes' theorem. It's related to Bayes' theorem, which is the revision of probabilities, and that's what medical professionals should be doing. So the case in Germany happened where people tested HIV positive, and the doctor said, you have HIV. The patient said, how certain? Well, yeah, you have it, look, it's right here. So then the person, it kind of affected their life a lot, and then 2 years later, or whatever the case is, they got tested again. Like, wait a minute, I never had it, and that's because the doctor did not revise the probabilities correctly. So, same here, the idea is we don't know whether you have the disease, we just have a sign, and all we can say is with a probability of whether you have it. This is the same idea, probability of whether there's an actual difference there. Unless you have population parameters, you always have to deal with probability. And you have to kind of balance those risks. So, yeah.
I kind of just want to take this medical example. If we could use it like for strep throat or something, because they take a test and then it's positive or negative, which I always assumed was just a binary, there's no other way around it. But is it more or less like these sort of tests just suggesting there's a high probability of you having strep?
Depending on the nature of the test, like the example is a strep throat. I don't know how sensitive the strep throat test is, but I guarantee you it's not saying with 100% certainty. I mean, maybe there's some tests that do, but most tests will not be for 100% certainty, right? So even like you think of like the pregnancy test, right? Well, then you're positive for pregnancy, well, then go to the doctor and get another test, et cetera, because they always have those little bit of error rates in there. And sometimes the error rate can actually be pretty big. So, when I'm referring to the example of the idea of maybe do I have colon cancer, well, what the doctor was basically saying is it's not very certain whether that test is even gonna give us good information, given your risk level and given your age and things like that. But you get into a different age band, apparently, and it's a better predictor. So think of it, clinicians in here, think of it in your clinical practice. It's the same reason why you do those things, right? Suicidality risk, what are your risk factors? Well, I have a lot of relatives who committed suicide. Probability, even if you're not computing anything, probability goes up, so this could be a high risk case. So when you think about it, statistics is about what? You're basically discriminating based on prior criteria, right? Based on prior criteria, you're trying to put the person into one group or another, high risk, low risk, what's the probability based on prior information. And this relates to what you'll learn in multivariate stats, which is a technique called discriminant analysis, which helps you discriminate between groups. So similar principles here. Don't make too much about those p-values. That's one of the scientific things here is, recognize the p-value, but if the p-value creeps up over 0.05, don't start throwing out your data and all that stuff. Scheffé test is the test I was talking about. It actually is pretty strict and actually guards against an infinite number of contrasts that can be performed, not only pairwise ones. So the Scheffé is gonna guard against like means 2 and 3 and 4 versus 5 and a whole bunch of all possible linear contrasts that you can do. Therefore, it's a pretty hard test to pass. If we look here, here's a Scheffé. What do we have? Well, there you go. Yep, there's the 2 versus 3. Got my mouse right on it. Right there. What was it before? 0.03. We did the Scheffé on it and it came out to 0.056. What happened here? Well, it cracked up a little bit over here too. What was that? 0.93 before? That's 0.94. Made it a bit harder, but here again, 0.05. Didn't quite reject the null at 0.05 there, whereas we did in the previous test. Shouldn't really surprise us that much because we're not looking at population parameters, right? We're not looking at population parameters. This is statistics based on sample data, and you say, well, a little bit of a tougher test. So the question becomes, then you gotta write this up, right? And forget the idea of, you can run a Newman coils, you can run a Tukey, you can run a Scheffé, you can run other tests too. There's nothing saying you gotta pick one test and do it. There's no type 1 error rate for running multiple post hoc tests, okay? So you can run different tests and see what the tests give you, but what do you conclude here? Like, do you conclude there's a difference? Do you not? What would be the correct way to write that up or be aware of what you're reading when you read it in the journal report? Perfectly fair to say using the Scheffé, we didn't quite reject. Using the Tukey, we did. And then if you understand that one is a little bit more strict than the other, then you take that into consideration. So again, the first look at how statistical modeling depends on what type of model you're using and what characteristics of the tools you're using to do the looking. It's not the same thing as looking at concrete. I like to say it's not the same thing as an archaeological dig, because the archaeological dig goes, look, we found something. Maybe they don't, I don't know, I'm guessing. Like, we found something, it's there. They don't really have the type 1. Maybe they do, maybe they go, I think there's something there, but we're not sure because we only have like a sample, so maybe they do. But pretend like it's not the same thing as saying, is there a marker here? Open it up, yes there is. Okay. So other post hoc tests, be familiar that there are others. We got this idea of contrast versus post hoc. So if you're working in your lab or you're reading research and they say we use such and such a post hoc test, just Google it, find out some of the characteristics about it, find out where it falls on that spectrum of kind of that toughness versus easiness. So contrast versus post hoc, well, here's the example we've talked about, right? So which comparison would you make? You'd go like mean 1 versus 3. And not 2 versus 3, yeah.
Does the contrast get, like, if you're reading a manuscript, is the contrast in the introduction section, is that where you put it, or would it be like, cause how would you be able to determine that you haven't looked at the means yet?
Well, you would have, if you're reporting it, okay, the question is where do you, if you're talking about a contrast or a post hoc, where do you say that you haven't looked at the means? Well, you would say that if you're writing it up your own manuscript, you'd say, based on our theoretical prediction, we believe means 3 and 4 would be different. Therefore, we did a planned comparison or a contrast. And this was the only contrast we made. Therefore, we have every right to believe the type 1 error rate is gonna be at whatever level we set the contrast at. And so you would introduce it in your paper and say, this was a planned comparison, this is a contrast. You're gonna, I mean, your readers have to trust that you haven't looked at the data, right? Which, you know, they gotta trust you, but you gotta say that was your theoretical prediction. Otherwise, I mean, what I suggest is, yeah, potentially going to the contrast instead of, you know, sometimes we just lay waste with post hocs, but the post hocs, you're gonna lose some power and it doesn't quite look as good. It's like, did you have any theoretical prediction? It's like snooping, right? It's like snooping, right? So if the dog is like snooping, right? It's snooping in the ground like that, looking for the bone. It's like when my dog looks for the bone or whatever, the ball, and he looks all over the place for half an hour, and then he comes back and says, I found it. I go, yeah, no kidding, you looked everywhere. Right? What is the dog doing? What type of test? So, you know, I throw the ball, throw the bone, I go find it, good boy, okay? Goes in, and Odie's like looking around, he's like that, and I'm like, geez, it's taking you so long, comes back, and he has it. I go, it took you half an hour. And the dog says, aren't you proud of me? Look what I can do. What am I, how am I reacting? Yeah, post hoc. I'm going, yeah, no kidding. What am I adjusting on his search abilities? I'm going, no kidding, you found it, you looked everywhere, right? No kidding, you found the difference. You looked at the data, you looked in every hole, and you just found out where it is. That's entirely different than if the dog's saying, smells, I know where that thing is, takes the one path towards the bone or the ball or whatever, goes, there it is. My last dog would dig a hole into the dirt about like a foot. You wanna talk about a contrast? Okay, would dig into the dirt, I'd be like, what are you digging at? He would dig for like about half an hour, and he would pull out a mouse.
No way.
I could not believe it. It was like this deep. He would dig and dig. I'd be like, what are you doing? And there was a mouse underneath the hole.
Wow.
That is a contrast.
I really
So-
appreciate that again.
No adjustment for type 1 error. If he dug up the whole property and found the mouse, I'd be like, not impressive. I'm gonna adjust your type 1 error rate. See? Yeah, okay. Sample size, well, this is gonna be on the next assignment. I'll show you the next assignment where you have to compute something in G-Power. So G-Power is a program for computing power analysis. And to enter G-Power, we have to compute this thing called F squared. And F squared is coming from, it's a statistic coming from Cohen's original derivations of power. Kind of like a weird statistic, but it's related to these R squared statistics, which we haven't really talked about very much. But these are very similar to the eta squared values. So when you do this in the assignment, you're gonna have to enter an F squared, and it'll say in the assignment how to enter this. It's actually gonna be a D value because you're gonna do it for a t-test. But if we look at the example here, you know, for this, well, in R, if we wanna do power analysis for the ANOVA, well, it's a one-way analysis of variance. K equals 5, number of levels on the independent variable. F, I have to take the square root of it to get 0.33, significance level, and the power of 0.9. So when I enter that information, what we get is, where is it? N is the number of, oh, there it is, it's already computed. 29.25, so this is 29.25 participants per group. So per level of that independent variable, that's how much I need because it's saying N is number in each group. So I'm running my power analysis based on my F value corresponding to an effect size in the table. Okay, so I'm entering the effect size and I'm computing power. The other program that's very popular is G-Power, which is what you're gonna compute in the assignment. And that's gonna give you your total sample size here. So you're gonna enter your effect size as F, you're gonna enter your alpha level, you're gonna enter your desired power, number of groups, and you're gonna compute power. For fixed effects, these are fixed effects. We can see here the different power curves, right? So power for different levels of effect size. So it's gonna change a little bit depending on your effect size. And what's more is the curves are not necessarily linear. They look a little bit linear towards the bottom, but then they actually get a little bit more curvilinear near the top. Let's see, so we do an example here in R. We're gonna do the achievement data we featured earlier. So this is gonna read in our data. We're gonna make a factor out of the factor teacher to let it know that it's a factor. What's a factor? Well, the factor has categorical levels to it, right? So it reports it as levels 1, 2, 3, 4. If you don't say factor, then what's R gonna read it as? It's gonna say 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's gonna treat it as a continuous variable. It's gonna think that there's actual numbers between there, like 1.1, 1.2, like it's a measured variable. So you have to tell it that, no, this is actually a factor. You can obtain the mean achievement scores for each of the 4 teachers. These are the same means that we got earlier. There's the mean overall of all the data is 79. So let's fit the ANOVA model. Well, there it is. So we just call it fit. You can call it anything really, but you specify AOV. There's many different ways of doing ANOVA in R. This is a common way. So AC tilde, that's as a function of, you can read that as a function of. Fteach, on what data? Well, it's the data we defined as achieve. Summary function will produce summary of models and things like that, so it's very, very general. That's what we get. So we look at that. What's our conclusion based on this? It's got a big, looks like it's got a big p-value, right? So wow, that's not very small, but minus 0.08, so move this 8 spots over here. So this is a really, really small p-value. You've got your f value, you got your mean squares. So what will we conclude? Well, I conclude, looks like we have a difference between means. We can get the effects for our data, okay? So these are the sample or treatment effects. What are these? The AJs. These are the AJs, which tells you deviations from the grand mean. And that's the function model tables that you can use. The plot design is kind of nice because it shows you where those means are. Mean 4 is getting to be a little bit different than the rest. Not surprisingly, the 1 versus 2, I mean, remember that one? That was the one that the Tukey test, that couldn't reject, and the Chaffee couldn't reject either, right? The Chaffee was actually tougher, but the 2 versus 1, those means are very close together. Evaluating assumptions. Now we talked about assumptions a little bit. We talked about assumptions. We will be talking about assumptions a lot more going into the spring. But assumptions are useful to see if all models are based on assumptions. You should have approximate normality. You should have approximately equal variances. Now for this data, the data is so small. The data is so small that looking at normality of distributions within group is pretty much impossible. So for this, we just ran a QQ plot, which if normality is basically satisfied on the QQ plot, the points should pretty much line up on the line. Okay, there's more to the QQ plot that we could spend time talking about, but that's basically what you're looking for to indicate whether you have normality. Not really normal. I mean, you look here, the overall plot of AC is not really normal, but we proceed with it anyways because it's what we really want is the normality per group. You can do an inferential test called the Shapiro-Wilks normality test. Okay, so each one of these tests, I mean, we can go through the formulas for these. It would take a lot longer than we have time for, but you look at this and you say, well, can I assume normality? And what this will do, the Shapiro-Wilks test will say, okay, well, you have a sample distribution of data. It's a sample distribution, it's sample points of data. let's look at that distribution and try to make an inferential statement about the overall population normality. So the test is yielding a p-value of 0.028, which is statistically significant, test at 0.05, but not at a more stringent level, okay? So what it's basically saying is saying, you know what? The assumption of normality, actually, you could probably reject that because your p-value is actually going to be pretty low. So null hypothesis, distribution's normal. Oops, nah, it doesn't look like it is. But you know what? It's based on such small sample data, and plus, who says 0.05 is the magic number? So that's why we say, you know, it's statistically significant at 0.05, but not at 0.01 or anything like that. So you know what? ANOVA is relatively robust to violations of normality. What do we mean by robust? I mean, you know what? You can still do the ANOVA even if you don't have perfect normality, because you're never gonna have perfect normality, so just run the test, run the test. Now, if your distributions are really, really ugly, then you may wanna stop and look at things a little bit closer, okay? So, now if you plot your distributions per group, and we will talk more about assumptions, again, as I said, in the spring when you have more time, but, you know, if you have, like, it's really abnormal, you may wanna stop and look at this. That's not actually too bad, but if it goes like this, that might cause a, you know, reason for concern. Now, why? There's two reasons. One, it could affect your type 1 error rate if you proceed with the ANOVA, but there's another reason why this might be a problem. There's a scientific reason why this might be a problem. What's the scientific reason? Let me just put this a little bit more like this and say like that. What's the science? Sometimes researchers get too immersed in the statistics. They look at the distribution, they plot it, and they say, oh my goodness, it's not normal. That's gonna affect my statistics. And they actually forget that this could actually indicate a scientific issue. What might be the scientific issue here that this could represent? First and foremost, we're doing this for science. So you look at this, your first reaction shouldn't be, it's gonna mess up my test. First reaction would be like, whoa, did we what this? Did we expect this? Did we expect the distribution to look like this? And if the answer is no, that's not really a statistical issue yet. It's a scientific one, because you're gonna say, why are we getting this distribution? Right? Why are we getting this distribution? Maybe there's an error. Maybe there's an error in our data. So check your data, check your lab assistants, right, who coded it, made a mistake. Put the 9 when it should have been a 0. Looked like a 9, looked like a 0, oops. All of a sudden, you have a whole bunch of zeros, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you don't have any 9s, and there's a big problem with the project, okay? So be aware of that, look at the distribution. What's the other thing? And so you look at that and say, check with the lab assistants, they go, no, everything's good, okay, you know what you're doing? Okay, what's the next problem with this? Wow, what's the next problem? The next problem is maybe you actually don't even have variability to analyze. How many car accidents you get into this month? 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0. At some point, if this is what your distribution is looking like, then maybe what's the issue from a scientific basis, from a psychometric basis? Yeah, you have nothing to analyze. You have nothing to analyze, and maybe just the measurement question didn't make sense. That's what I mean psychometrically, psychological measurement, test measurement. Maybe what you're seeking to measure doesn't make that much sense because there's so low variability, and asking people how many car accidents they got in a week or a month just doesn't afford meaningful data. Maybe because everyone's gonna say 0, and that's very difficult to analyze. So look at it scientifically before you address the statistical issue, before you address the statistical issue. Now, if the distributions are wildly abnormal, you could perform transformations on the data. And again, we'll talk about those a little bit in the spring. But most of the time, you really won't need to. Transformation, I mean, like take the square root, take the logarithms and things like that, try to normalize distributions. And some people get really really into those things, they wanna do all kinds of transformations and stuff like that. Usually you don't need to unless there's really serious issues, and check with the person you're working with, plot out your distributions, have a look, be interested in your data, get to know your data, do a little bit of what they call exploratory data analysis, and if there's a serious problem, you might have to make a slight adjustment. Sometimes when data is extreme, it's the outliers that are doing it, right? Like you have a few points here that's kind of drawing the distribution and making it highly skewed. So sometimes those points can be addressed. But usually, if your distribution, looks like that, that's absolutely no problem, okay? That's absolutely no problem. Why? Because as we say, the ANOVA is fairly robust to violations of normality. Let's still say you're not sure. Let's still say you're not sure. You're really bothered by the abnormal, you saw the abnormal distribution today and you went home, you're like, this doesn't sit well. You're like not sure. You talk with a couple people, they're like, I don't know, leave it as is, I don't know. Do a transformation, you walk late at night, you're thinking about it, you're like, "Geez, I don't know. Really, yeah, you're really troubled. What can you do? What can you do? Right? What can you do? I mean, the bottom line, you say, I'm not gonna worry about it anymore, I'm gonna analyze my data. What could you do when the results come in? As a scientist, the statistics are gonna come out. What's the bottom line? Well, be careful about your p-value a little bit. We're already careful about it, but p-value comes up to be a little bit low, a little bit high. Say, well, my assumptions weren't actually perfectly satisfied. So, as a scientist, I'm not gonna split hairs with the p-values. And I'm just gonna, maybe just not massage things, but just take that into consideration a little bit. Kind of like the first snowfall when you're driving on all-season tires, like, just take it easy.
Would your distribution, like where it varies, would that give you any indication about how to interpret your p-values?
Well, yeah, what the simulation studies generally say is that if the violation happens in kind of like severely opposite directions, then you could have a problem. If the skewness is kind of like, all your distributions are slightly skewed in the same direction, not too bad, and you have equal N per group, which is kind of the big thing too, you usually don't have that much to worry about. If one distribution is wildly different than another distribution, it may cause a little bit of a concern, may affect that type of error rate a little bit. But again, it's usually not enough for you to make any drastic changes, right? Like sometimes I have students come up to me and say, my distributions are perfectly normal. It's like, you're fine, go with it. Well, it's gonna affect my p-value. Well then, don't take your p-value too seriously, Just give a little wiggle room, which you're gonna do anyways, right? No one's gonna say 0.04, 0.051 like that. Just take that in consideration a little bit, okay? Let's get to a break in a second. Equality of variance test, there's different tests available. There's the Bartlett's, there's Levine's test, which is often one in SPSS. SPSS likes Levine's test. Evaluation on variances to see if you have equality of variances. So there's another test you can do. Remember too, that the variance test, there's issues with that test too. So, if your test suggests you have an inequality issue, doesn't mean you gotta stop everything. And SPSS will give you that line to say, well, assume unequal variances, and we'll do the adjustment, right? Similar to what we've done already in terms of that degree of freedom adjustment. So you can assume that line, you can read off that line. You'll see little differences between the p-values, but usually not very much. There's our Tukey test, which we did earlier, and there's some confidence intervals. Here's another way of analyzing it too. You can do what's called a linear model, which we're on the verge of talking about in regression. And that one will actually, when you analyze it this way, it actually gives you contrasts. It actually gives you contrast between groups. So this intercept value here, that's the mean achievement for students assigned to the first teacher. That's how this is going to set up your model. This will make a lot more sense when we start looking at regression. But just to let you know, there are different ways you can analyze it. It's gonna give you the same overall F statistic, but different ways of analyzing it. So you've got the mean of the first group, then you got teach two, and the teach two is a comparison of the second group and the first group. There's that 1.5 unit difference, et cetera, et cetera. So this analysis actually gives you a comparison and contrast without adjustment. There's no adjustment made there, but it gives you a comparison of those mean values. So you could look at that and say, hey, do we have a difference between, you know, the first and third? Yes, we do, right? Yes, we do. Do you have a difference between the first and fourth? Yes, we do, because you could read off the F-teach 4 line. Okay. So different ways to do it. Do you have a difference between the first and the second? No, 0.55 over there. Notice one thing, right? The F-teach 2 versus F-teach 1. What do you notice about that p-value? 0.55. Boy, that seems kind of welcome for us, right? Because you look at that, what was that p-value before? Now, Tukey and Chaffee really had a go at that one, right? What did Tukey and Chaffee do to that? Where was this?
0.9.
Yeah, it was like 0.93, and then Chaffee came around 0.94, like even worse, right? Even worse. Boy, look what happens when you don't do the adjustment. 0.55. Still can't reject, that's still way too high, but still it's like, wow, you see what those post hocs are doing. So in the case where you're not even rejecting, then the post hoc's making it worse, but in the case where we reject anyways. Kruskal-Wallis test, might cover that, you don't have to worry about that, but that's a non-parametric test, and we're not really covering non-parametric tests yet in the course, and that'll happen in the spring a bit more, but you don't have to worry about the Kruskal-Wallis. This is a non-parametric if you can't assume assumptions. This bases it on ranks, and it does the test based on ranks, and it's kind of does something similar to the ANOVA, but on ranks. And there's an example of doing it in ANOVA. There's your quality of variances. There it's not giving you the adjustment for unequal variances, but that's giving you a p-value of 0.001, so you would reject the equality variance assumption. And there's your output for SPSS. We gotta talk about what partial eta squared is after the break, but we can see that there's an effect for teach. The other stuff we're going to be unpacking as we go, corrected model, intercept, those things we need more regression knowledge to understand what those really are. Let's see, here we have the teach, we have the error. Then it's giving you this R squared, which is the same thing as eta squared for this analysis. And we're almost on the cusp of talking about regression. These things will make some sense. Here's the robust test using Welch. There, correction, right? It's a correction, saying, you know what, if you can't assume equality of variances, we're gonna make it really a little bit harder, a little bit of an adjustment. Notice your degrees of freedom, you know, took a little bit of a took a bit of a hit, and there you're gonna reject anyways. Okay. So why don't we take a break, and we'll come back, and we'll look at some of the technical details on factorial ANOVA, which we started last week.
I enjoyed the comment, we can cry, then I realized we can't cry because we don't understand it. You can't cry about it if you don't understand. Let's go see.
I've already done my crying from there.
I'm gonna go see.
Take a nap. October 18th is not October 18th? What is this?
I wish it was.
I know, right? That's the day after my birthday.
Article 1 says 2 different studies reported in one article, and then the purpose of these, circle it and like a question mark. I'm like, dude, come on, bro.
Just adjust it.
It's funny, yeah.
You know, we could discuss a lot more if it wasn't 3 hours.
I mean, like, even if it was 3 hours, can it be any other any day than Friday. You know what I mean? Like, I get so exhausted by Friday from a week, I'm just like, then I have to gear up
Or
for
it was just
working.
earlier.
Yeah, like something. Why noon to
9.
3,
Yeah.
you know? What kind of pizza is that? Did you make it?
Barbecue chicken.
Did you get it at Ridge? It's gluten free.
My roommate got it.
Oh, sweet. You guys seriously consider moving to the peak or the source or whatever? I might make that move. It's so nice to fuel. I'm just talking about gyms.
Or your fuel?
No fuel.
I moved from the source to fuel.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, when do you usually work out?
What do I do?
Yeah,
When?
what time of day?
Afternoon?
Okay.
Why?
Not like, so when,
What's the,
when I
that's
was-
another question. When's traffic getting there? How bad is
5
it?
o'clock.
5 o'clock traffic?
It was absolutely, so there's two things. So the source is on Russell, and if you're there
Oh my
anywhere
God,
after
you're gonna
4 to
think about
4 to
that.
6,
You're trapped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when I was there, I was working full time, so I'd get off work and then go. And fuel wasn't here yet, so I don't know how thinned out it's gotten.
Feels
But
so
I
nice.
moved to
I like
fuel because there were times where I literally I couldn't do anything because everything was taken and there were just people everywhere. I like the
Yeah.
source, there's nothing, I don't have anything against the source, all their equipment's
Just
nice and
location?
it's just small. Yeah, and location for me too as well, cause I ended up, I live right across Patty Creek, from Patty Creek Market.
Oh, okay.
So I'm on that side of town, so fuel's way closer to me than having to drive down Russell anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I live outside of town no matter what, so.
Yeah, so that doesn't matter too
Doesn't
much.
matter to
But
me,
just depends, like, for me,
Right.
what I would say is try it out, but it depends on when you go, because if you're going anytime around 5 o'clock, I don't think you're gonna enjoy yourself.
No, I usually go like 11, 1 o'clock,
Yeah, I don't think there should be a problem with that.
something like that, you know?
You always try it out.
I definitely like to try it out, 'cause I need weights, but I don't know if they have what are their weights compared to Fuel's weights?
So fuel
Or like
obviously
machines.
geared more towards like bodybuilding than